A silk canopy flutters in the heat above a motionless figure. Her eyes are open, but unblinking. The air is heavy with rot disguised by rosewater. On the marble tiles below her bed, a servant kneels not to pray, but to beg for mercy no one can grant. It is summer in Madrid. The court stinks of incense and fear. They called her La Reina Castiza, the chaste queen. Portraits show her serene, pale, untouched, the embodiment of Catholic virtue. But what the paintings don't tell you is that under her silks, her body festered. Isabel de Bourbon, Queen of Spain, did not change her underwear for months. She believed it was pious, holy even. Washing the flesh was a temptation of the devil. Dirt meant discipline. Suffering meant sainthood, but as her body decayed, so did her empire. Outside her palace walls, the Spanish countryside withered in famine. Cities choked in filth. The Inquisition burned books and bodies alike. Physicians prescribed bloodletting for plague. And through it all, nobles bathed in perfume instead of water, terrified that cleanliness might weaken the soul. The queen's unwashed body became a quiet metaphor, a monarch, while Spain bled dry. One woman's devotion to divine purity was a symptom of something far more obscene. A kingdom where disease was mistaken for destiny, and death was the cost of obedience. Today, we strip away the legend. This is not the story of a prudish queen who skipped her bath. It is the story of how a court's obsession with purity led to plague, how superstition smothered science, how ideology rotted flesh, and how an empire collapsed under its own sacred stink. She sat on a throne of velvet and gilt. The air around her did not move. It lingered thick with rose oil, musk, and the faint staleness of old flesh beneath brocade. Light filtered through latticed windows in thin, reverent shafts, illuminating her face like a saint in a painting, still and remote. Her hands did not twitch. Her breath came shallow. To approach her was to enter a chapel, not a court. And yet, beneath the incense and silence, there was something else, something rotting. Queen Isabel of Bourbon was 15 when she was shipped across the mountains and silenced by duty. She was told to smile, to bear, to birth, and above all, to obey. Her beauty was remarked upon as if it belonged to Spain now. Her chastity was paraded like an heirloom relic. Her flesh was no longer hers. They draped her in silks embroidered with prayers, corseted her ribs until her voice turned to whispers, powdered her cheeks until they vanished. She was a symbol now, a Catholic queen, the living idol of purity. Every eye watched her for cracks, so she gave them none. She sat still when the lice bit. She flinched inwardly when the perfume stung her sores. She clenched her thighs as discharge, soaked the linen she would not change. She did not ask for the sheets to be laundered. She did not complain of the sweat that stuck to her back like a second skin. To clean the body was to feed its temptation. To itch was holy. To stink was sacred. They said she smelled like sanctity. They meant she smelled like death. Around her, the court mimicked. Nobles avoided water like a sign. Servants learned to hide their nausea with practiced smiles. The queen's stillness became the fashion of the court, motionless, mute, perfumed. They worshipped her as a creature above flesh, and so they abandoned their own. She learned to survive, not by resisting, but by disappearing. Her voice turned to velvet, her desires folded into pleats of her gown. She became fluent in restraint. Even her eyes stopped asking questions. Sometimes she saw her reflection in the polished silver of her spoon. She watched herself not as a person, but as a performance. What she saw was not a woman. It was a ghost in golden fabric, too frightened to rebel and too revered to breathe. The priests told her pain was a gift. The king told her silence was love. The ladies in waiting told her nothing at all because they had forgotten how to say anything that wasn't permission. The chambers smelled always of lavender, incense, and something beneath it, a darker smell that never left the room even when the windows were thrown open. She was praised most when she did nothing. She understood then. To be good was to be still. To be holy was to let the body decay without protest. So she let it. In time, her pores grew clogged with powders and prayers. Rashes bloomed where silk touched skin. Lice nested in the seams of her gowns. The linen between her legs stiffened with old blood. But she bore it all with beatific calm, and they called it virtue. No one asked what it felt like to wear the same chemise through a season of fever. No one dared. To serve God, she had been told, was to suffer without sound. And so she suffered until her breath became the only sign she still lived. And when that breath turned shallow, they whispered of miracles. She was not a woman anymore. She was a relic still breathing. And relics do not sweat. Relics do not scream. Outside the palace walls, something darker stirred. But inside she remained, frozen, a queen made of wax and obedience, embalmed in perfume and penance, and the stench beneath the roses was growing stronger. The saints did not flinch when the flesh split open. They welcomed it. They bled in silence. They starved until their ribs grew sharp and their breath shallow. They soaked their sores in vinegar and called the pain holy. It was said that the holiest among them gave off a fragrance at the hour of death, not the stench of decay, but the perfume of paradise. The faithful called it the odor of sanctity. No one asked how many baths were skipped to earn it. Isabel knew those stories by heart. She had been raised on them, stitched into her skin like her baptismal lace. Women who scrubbed their bodies were whispered about in shame. Women who endured without cleansing were praised in prayer. When her thighs chafed under unwashed linen, when her underarms bloomed with pustules, when her skin cracked beneath layers of cloth, in time she said nothing. And each time she said nothing, they bowed. Deeper, her filth became a sacrament. In dark chapels across Castile, the sermons were clear. The body was a traitor. It burned with temptation. It begged for comfort. It whispered sin. To deny its needs was not neglect. It was salvation, especially for women. A man could conquer the world. A woman was meant to conquer herself. So she learned to obey the silence. Of rot, it was not just her. In the convents, girls scraped their scalps bald and wore belts of thorns beneath their habits. They bled in secret and thanked God for the favor. In royal courts, noble women fainted from heat beneath 12 layers of cloth. They bore the smell of old sweat and rosewater like armor. To scrub too hard, to remove too much, was to dishonor God's design. The body was not to be renewed, it was to be endured. When Isabel turned her head on the pillow and inhaled the scent of her own sour flesh, she imagined saints sighing in approval. The stench beneath her skirts grew darker in the summer. It was not the scent of laziness or accident. It was deliberate, and it was divine. She no longer noticed when the rash spread from thigh to hip. When the chambermaids avoided her gaze, she assumed it was reverence. When the royal physician recoiled, he called it reverence too. No one spoke the truth, because to speak it would be to risk heresy. To question the stink of holiness was to question holiness itself. And so they smothered their revulsion with incense and prayer, and the room grew heavier. She was not suffering. She was ascending. Her flesh was her altar, and every crack in it, every wound left to fester, every maggot birthed in the folds of linen that hadn't been changed in weeks, that was a kind of offering. The queen no longer remembered the sensation of clean skin. She only remembered approval, and in that silence, where no one dared intervene, devotion became a death sentence dressed in silk. The ones who kissed her hand did so through tears, but never protest, because what they smelled was not a woman. It was doctrine. It was obedience. It was the cost of heaven, laid bare in the rot of a body denied relief. The sacred stench clung not just to her skin, but to the throne, the bedding, the kingdom itself, and no amount of prayer could make it fade. The halls of power stank not of politics, but of flesh. The smell drifted through velvet corridors, settled into carved wood, climbed into the hair of children too young to name their inheritance. It was sweet and sour, like decay hidden under. Jasmine, like sanctity that curdled. It did not begin with Isabel. She was merely the most visible blossom on a long dead branch. In the royal salons, men in embroidered doublets scratched their scalps until blood dotted their lace collars. The lice were not pests, they were proof of humility, proof of piety. Cleanliness was suspect, vanity, pride, a slippery slope to lust. Better to wear the itch as armor. The nobility stopped bathing and called it devotion. They anointed themselves with oils instead, thick, cloying, scented with citrus or myrrh. But the stench of what lay beneath was never quite masked. Their skin cracked under the wax. Rashes rippled beneath jeweled cuffs. Breath turned foul behind powdered lips, yet still they bowed and whispered amen. Physicians obeyed the creed of their masters. They abandoned anatomy for prayer. They let wounds rot if the rot came from noble flesh. To sweat was divine. To exude filth was evidence of endurance. They bled the sick with leeches, trained the weak to balance invisible humors, prescribed prayer over poultice. It was not healing they were taught to pursue. It was harmony. And in that harmony, the rot was welcomed. Priests, too, joined the chorus. They preached from pulpits that God detested polished skin, that the devil was most at home in the bathhouse, that Eve first sinned not by desire, but by wanting to be clean. They warned young girls to avoid mirrors, told wives to keep their bodies hidden, even from themselves. In palaces and parishes alike, dirt became divine, and the deeper the stench. Soaked in, the more sacred it was declared. Windows remained shut even in midsummer to keep the soul from escaping. Gowns were never washed, only layered. A noblewoman might wear 30 pounds of embroidered holiness and never remove a single. Peace for months. Children were swaddled in damp wool. Servants collapsed under the heat, and no one moved to open a door. The queen's silence was not seen as illness. It was instruction. Every motion she did not make became a rule. Every infection she endured was mimicked. Nobility is not defined by resistance, but by imitation. And so the whole court followed her into filth, into fever, into ruin. The lice moved from courtier to courtier like rosary beads passed in prayer. The bedding of kings grew black with sweat and sacred insects. Silver trays carried food past chamber pots that hadn't been emptied in weeks. Holy relics were stored beside jars of pus. Nothing was discarded. To remove was to desecrate. There were whispers, of course, behind doors, behind hands, murmurs of madness, of sickness, of something too quiet to name. But none dared speak them aloud, because to wash would be rebellion. To cleanse would be heresy. To question the stink was to question the throne. And so they sat unmoving, unwashed, crowned in their own decay. The queen was not the exception. She was the rule, and every perfumed noble who kissed her hand helped write a new scripture one where rot was reverence, and the foulest air was the breath of God. There was a time when water was salvation. Cold rivers, tiled bathhouses, steaming basins carved in marble. Once, people bathed to feel reborn. Once, cleansing was communion. But fire consumes what it fears. And the church feared the flesh. The doors of the bathhouses were sealed with wax and stamped with holy symbols. Not because they were abandoned, but because they were condemned. The stone tubs, where bodies had once floated like offerings to. Purity now stood dry and hollow, like sarcophagi for sins unnamed. The church had declared it. Water temps. It slips beneath the fabric. It awakens the skin. It softens the will. In the bath, a woman might feel too free. A man might see too much. Lust begins, they said, with heat and moisture. So it had to end there too. The wash became a risk. And in Spain, where fire was always hungrier than truth, the risk was burned into law. The water that once healed the sick was now blamed for making them ill. Physicians warned that bathing opened the pores to disease. That water carried miasma. That to strip and soak was to invite death under the skin. Better to sweat than to soak. Better to smell of sanctity than sin. So the people obeyed. In kitchens and monasteries, in noble courts and broken villages, basins stayed empty. The soap hardened into crust. Fingernails blackened, scalps festered. Children grew up never knowing the sound of dripping water unless it came from the heavens. They washed with wine, with oil, with vinegar and prayer, but never with water. And when the fever came, they blamed those who still clung to the old ways. The secret bathers, the midwives, the foreigner with the well, the woman who boiled her linens in the dark. She must be hiding something, they whispered. A clean woman was a suspicious woman. Fear always finds flesh to punish. Even rain began to feel dangerous. A blessing turned curse. The city streets flooded with waste when the gutters failed, and still no one swept. The fountains dried up, but the perfume sellers thrived. And when the queen's own chambermaids whispered of the sores beneath her bodice, they whispered quietly. To suggest she be bathed was to flirt with rebellion. Water, once the most innocent of elements, had been transformed. It no longer meant life. It meant danger, deviance, disobedience. It was for sinners, heretics, witches, lovers. It was not for the faithful. Even the rivers looked ashamed. They curled through the countryside like veins no longer carrying blood. Still silent, watching as the kingdom shriveled in its own sacred filth. The priests blessed the dry season. The nobles lit incense to mask the stench. The peasants prayed to saints carved in stone, but dared not cleanse their hands before kneeling. To touch water was to risk becoming visible. To scrub the body was to uncover it. And nothing was more terrifying than being seen. And so the land dried with its people. A slow, obedient dying. Not from war or famine or even plague, but from a silence that called itself holy. It began with silence. A stillness too deep to be peace. Dogs stopped barking. Markets grew thin. The bells rang more often and always in threes. First the old, then the children, then the ones too strong to die until they did. The plague didn't. Howl into Castile. It crept through seams in the walls, through unwashed cloth, through the breath of the faithful kneeling side by side. It wore no crown, carried no weapon. It entered without knocking and took without mercy. And when it took, it left the doors open, bodies stiffened in prayer, tongues blackened mid-confession. Mothers wept until blood came from their eyes and still begged the saints to intercede. But the saints were silent. The relics were cold. The Virgin remained clean in her frame while the streets turned to graves. And still, they did not wash. When the sores appeared first red, then purple, then spilling, they did not cleanse them. They wrapped them in old cloth, the same cloth they'd used for the birth, for the feast, for the funerals. Cloth soaked with 100 histories, and no soap. The priests did not isolate the sick. They gathered them in candlelit processions that smeared the cobblestones with wax and pus. They carried statues of saints through infected air and forced the dying to march behind them. Flagellants tore open their backs in the town squares. Blood mingled with bile. Faith mingled with fear. The plague did not slow. They said God was testing them, so they screamed louder, whipped harder, refused the urge to flee. To run was to doubt. To heal was to sin. No apothecary dared speak above the church. No woman dared boil water in the open. The only cure permitted was submission. The doctors prescribed leeches and lavender. The monks prescribed ashes and salt. No one prescribed distance or cleanliness or truth, because the plague was not treated as a disease. It was treated as a punishment. And punishments must be endured, not escaped. In the palace, the queen did not rise. She lay in shadow, limbs like driftwood, fevered breath rattling against silken pillows. Her skin peeled in silence. Her undergarments remained unchanged. Her chambermaids whispered prayers as they wiped her sores with perfumed cloth, careful not to disturb the rot. She did not speak. She did not scream. But her stillness was seen. As holiness, so the people imitated her. When entire streets collapsed into silence, they praised the dead for their patience. When families nailed shut their own doors from the inside, they called it reverence. No one rebelled. No one questioned. To disobey the ritual was to risk the soul, and the plague obeyed the silence. It spread where incense was thickest. It lived. In cathedrals, in robes that were never washed, in holy water that hadn't been changed in months. It curled beneath altars and settled into the mouths of the faithful. It knew that in Spain, obedience was stronger than survival. The poor died. First, they always do. They died begging for bread, for medicine, for soap. They died holding rosaries. They died outside locked doors, unheard. And when their bodies piled too high for the cartman to carry, they burned them in fields behind monasteries where no one was allowed to watch. Still, the sermons did not change, still. The bells kept ringing, still. The queen lay in her bed, breathing the same fetid air that had already taken half her kingdom. And somewhere, beneath it all, the plague smiled. Not because it was powerful, but because it never had to fight. The fire did not flicker. It devoured. It rose clean and bright in the town square, fed by damp wood and old parchment. The smoke curled upward like a prayer no one meant. Her name was not shouted as she burned. It was whispered because it was. Already being erased, she had delivered too many babies without blessing. Too many mothers had survived her touch. Too few had bled to death under her care. And she had spoken once in a courtyard of boiling linens, of washing hands, of invisible things that passed between skin and breath. Now her mouth was sewn shut with ash. In Spain, to understand nature was to threaten the divine. And threats were never debated. They were silenced. The Inquisition, long drunk on the blood of heretics, found new prey in knowledge. Not just those who doubted Scripture, but those who questioned filth. A physician who urged water over incense. A midwife who washed her instruments. A scribe who copied forbidden Greek texts on plague and putrefaction. They were not just wrong. They were dangerous because they peeled back the curtain and pointed to something older than fear. Truth. But Spain did not want truth. It wanted order. And in that order, everything must kneel. Even the wind, even the flesh, even the seasons. So the inquisitors turned their gaze from witches to thinkers, from books to blood, from faith to fact. They dragged surgeons into cells and broke there, fingers one by one, until they confessed to seeing what no one wanted seen. They tortured scholars who mapped the stars. They shattered glass jars filled with herbs, with insects, with water drawn from wells. They crushed observation beneath. The heel of revelation, to suggest the world was knowable, was to commit blasphemy. Nature was no longer a teacher. It was a traitor. The rain became suspect. The wind a spy. A woman who studied her own womb was likened to Eve holding the serpent. Every leaf, every pulse, Every pattern became a whisper from the devil, unless sanctioned by the church and thee. Church sanctioned only silence. Inside the palace, the queen's pulse slowed to a crawl. No medicine was permitted that came from the wrong mouths. No treatments allowed unless they echoed scripture. She was left to the care of relics and chants, while her blood blackened in her veins, and still they called it devotion. Doctors stood, helpless at the edges of power, watching as the dying multiplied and their voices shrank. To speak was to risk the flame. To remain silent was to join the grave, and so the knowledge that could have cleansed the kingdom was buried beneath its own altar. The children of Castile coughed into cloth too sacred to wash. The women bled onto stone floors, while the midwives, who once saved them, dangled from ropes. The healers fled into shadow or vanished into smoke, and the plague did not slow. It obeyed the silence. This was not a war against disease. It was a war against witness. A war where every candle snuffed was a mind unlit, where every screen behind closed doors was a cure lost forever. Spain did not burn the devil that century. It burned the cure. She was still breathing, but no longer alive. The windows of her chamber had been shuttered for weeks. Light was an intrusion, and so was truth. Inside, everything was velvet, hushed, embalmed in ritual. The air was thick with the same incense. Used to bless corpses, it clung to the fabric of her bed curtains, soaked into the damask walls. Tried in vain to cover the stench of a body turning inward, her skin had lost its shape, yellowed, brittle, blooming with lesions. A fever never broke. Her hair stuck to her temples in slick ropes, strands falling loose each time her head turned. And she turned it rarely now. Those who entered did not speak. They crossed themselves at the threshold and stepped carefully, as if approaching an altar. Some still called her holy. Others wept behind fans. But all of them knew, even if they did not name it, that what lay in that bed was no longer a queen. It was a mirror. Her belly, once revered as the cradle of royal blood, had swollen with fluid. Her face was no longer a face, but a mask, expressionless, stretched thin, unable to conceal the slow collapse happening beneath. Her lips moved sometimes, mouthing prayers no one could hear. The bed linens were never changed. They hardened under her, stiff with sweat, decay, and sacred refusal. Her attendants dabbed her mouth with cloth perfumed in rosewater and holy oil, but it made no difference. Her breath was sour. Her groin festered. Her flesh, when touched, made a sound like wet paper. Spain watched her die by imitation. Beyond the palace walls, the empire mirrored its queen, bloated from famine, stiffened by ritual, bleeding beneath golden embroidery. Cities that once pulsed with trade now lay still. Silver flowed out of mines and into coffers, but none into the mouths of the starving. Priests paraded relics, while fields lay fallow. The empire coughed, and no one dared name the sickness. Every infection in her blood was echoed in the empires. Veins, every swelling limb, a conquered province now rotting from neglect. Every whisper behind the queen's chamber doors, a metaphor for a kingdom too obedient to scream. No reforms, no questions. Just prayer, silence, and slow decomposition. She had become what the empire feared most, visibly dying, and there was no miracle left to cover it. The royal physicians, paralyzed by doctrine, refused to name the illness. The priests offered relics pressed to her brow. Her husband, the king, prayed at her bedside, lips moving without sound, the space between them thick with old guilt and the perfume of things already lost. There would be no dramatic end, no final cry, just a slow drift into stillness. And when that stillness came, it would not feel like peace. It would feel like confirmation. Her death was not an ending. It was a diagnosis. The empire had built itself on obedience, and now that obedience had turned to rot. What was sacred had become septic. What was virtuous had become fatal. The queen did not die despite her devotion. She died because of it, and the empire, kneeling beside her with closed eyes and folded hands, followed suit quietly, faithfully, into the grave. The body was buried, but the scent remained. It clung to the velvet cushions of abandoned chambers, to the wood-paneled walls of palaces where no footsteps echoed anymore. It lingered in the pages of prayer books, pressed between dried petals and flaked wax. A fragrance not of memory, but of denial. Spain did not collapse in fire. It crumbled in incense. While the rest of Europe cracked open its windows and let in air and thought, Spain sealed its doors tighter. While others dipped their fingers into ink and invention, Spain dipped its relics in oil, lit another candle, and recited the same prayers from the same mouths that had refused to name the rot. Gold still shimmered in the cathedrals, but the altars were empty. Children starved within reach of silver crosses. Scholars fled. Midwives vanished. The air was thick with ritual, but thin with breath. Progress became a sin, and yet the court still smelled of roses, of sanctified oils rubbed into the wrists of dying nobles, of lavender poured over floors never scrubbed. The fragrance was not one of healing, it was embalming. Spain embalmed itself, in titles, in tradition, in lace that yellowed around the necks of girls too obedient to ask why they bled without reason. The Inquisition did not die. It was inherited. The fear of knowing was passed from mother to daughter, priest to scribe, king to dust, and while across the Pyrenees, minds were sharpening into revolutions, Spain drifted, a slow, fragrant sleep. The empire did not scream as it fell. It whispered. It clutched its crucifixes and rotted gently, convinced that obedience would be rewarded, that the scent of old holiness was proof of favor, not decay. But holiness, when untended, turned sour dot, and the world moved on, leaving Spain. In the stillness of a sealed tomb, dressed in embroidered silence, perfumed for a funeral that had already taken place. It was never about the body. It was about what the body could be made to symbolize, what could be suppressed, what could be shamed, what could be owned. Cleanliness in Spain had not been a comfort. It was a threat. To bathe was to claim yourself. To scrub the skin was to uncover the truth beneath it. And truth raw, open, unperfumed was too dangerous to permit, so they called the filth holy. And people believed them, because if you keep a people afraid of their own reflection, you never need chains. The rot that ate through Queen Isabel's thighs had been carved into law long before it touched her flesh. The stink in her bedchamber came not from her, but from power thick, unwashed, unquestioned. The odor was a warning, repeated in every parish and palace. Suffer and be loved for it. Cleanse, and you are already guilty. Purity became performance, and performance became policy. In the end, the body was not protected. It was policed. Smell was suspicion. Water was rebellion. And silence was the fragrance of loyalty. Women were folded into linen until they forgot their shape. Men were praised for their pallor. The kingdom knelt not in prayer, but in rot, and no one dared ask what lived beneath the perfume. Spain did not fall because of disease. It fell because it mistook obedience for virtue, because it buried the body under incense and never asked who lit the match. Cleanliness was power, and so they made dirt divine. And by the time anyone remembered how to breathe, the grave had already been sealed with lavender, with silence, with the lie that it had always been this way.